Good morning. It's still morning, but it's almost noon. And if you could begin to take your seats, we'll begin. I'm Taves, and as most of you probably know, one of the duties of the President of the American Academy of Religion is to invite a set of plenary speakers. And this address that we're about to hear this morning is the first of the invited speakers. And I asked Frans de Waal to give a plenary address here today because he looks at humans with an eye to what we share with our primate kin. He's trained as a zoologist with a specialization in primate behavior, and he is the C.H. Chandler Professor in Psychology at Emory University and Director of the Living Links Center, which is an integrated part of the Yerkes National Primate Research Center here in Atlanta. Among primatologists, Frans de Waal is known worldwide both for his scholarly research and for his gift in conveying complex research findings to the general public. He's published a number of books, beginning with Chimpanzee Politics, which came out in 1982 and has since been reissued in 2 subsequent editions, and Peacemaking Among Primates, which came out in 1989 and won an LA Times Book Award. With the founding of the Living Links Center in 1997, which is devoted to primate studies that shed light on human behavioral evolution, his books have focused primarily on the evolutionary origins of human morality. I just hit your, okay. His books, sorry about that, have just focused primarily on the evolutionary origins of human morality. These include Good-Natured, the origins of right and wrong in humans and other animals, then Primates and Philosophers, how morality evolved, and most recently, The Age of Empathy, which just came out in 2009. In the last decade, scholars in fields outside of religious studies have offered a flurry of new evolutionary theories of religion based on the work of scholars such as Frans de Waal. To many of us in religious studies and in the humanities more generally, however, this may seem like the resurgence of a problematic kind of thinking that dominated the early years of our discipline, but which we have long rejected. There is, however, a distinct difference between the stage theories of cultural evolution that infused many late 19th century theories of religion and the neo-Darwinian synthesis, which was consolidated during the mid-20th century. The former, which presupposed a teleological movement from the primitive to the civilized, provoked a backlash in the 20th century that is now still widely presupposed throughout much of the humanities. The neo-Darwinian synthesis of the mid-20th century, however, combined breakthroughs in genetics with the Darwinian ideas of random variation and natural selection and allowed researchers to make a retrospective distinction between genetic and cultural theories of evolution. Though there are still many ways in which these two might be related, and those ways are hotly contested, the modern discussions share some important presuppositions. First, they tend to assume that genetically we do not differ from our hunter-gatherer ancestors. Second, insofar as culture can be said to evolve, most theorists do not posit teleologically driven stages, but rather varieties of cultural adaptations to particular environments. And third, they assume that comparisons between humans and other primates can shed light on human behavioral evolution. While such comparisons do not overlook differences, our historic tendency to distance ourselves from our primate kin makes the similarities between us and our kin at least as interesting. Indeed, I suspect the consideration of these similarities has the potential to turn the study of religion upside down. Instead of assuming that everything we think of as religion is a product of language and human-style culture, comparisons between ourselves and other primates allow us to consider the abilities and behaviors that we share with other social animals, especially other primates, and the ways that these shared behaviors have contributed to the emergence of human morality and religiosity. It's precisely this connection between human morality and primate behavior that Frans de Waal will take up today in his lecture titled Morality Before Religion, Empathy, Reciprocity, and Fairness in Our Fellow Primates. There's probably, hold on 1 minute, there's probably not going to be time for questions after his address, but we've scheduled a special session following this one, which will start 15 minutes late at 1:15 over in the Marquis Marriott, or the Marriott, Marquis Ballroom A, in which we will have a conversation between Frans de Waal and two senior scholars of religion, Kimberly Patton and Armin Geertz. So we encourage you to attend to that and to hash out some of the implications of the plenary that you're about to hear now. Thank you very much, and please welcome Frans de Waal.
Welcome to Atlanta, where I live here and work. And I'm sure it's unusual for you to get an address that contains a lot of animals, but that's what I'm going to do because I work with animals. But I do have an enormous interest in morality and the evolution of morality. The classical view of humans in their natural state is that we are like wolves to each other. And I always take issue with that because I think it's insulting to the wolves to describe them as just only nasty. Because wolves are highly cooperative and highly social animals, and if we are like wolves in every regard, there's nothing to be ashamed of, actually. There have been painters. Recently I wrote a blog for the New York Times, and I'm actually from the city where Bosch named himself after. And so I'm very familiar with his paintings because I grew up with them. And Bosch, in his triptych, The Garden of Earthly Delights, which we call in Dutch the Garden of Lusts, actually. The Garden of Lusts is all about sex and food, and that's maybe humans in their natural state. And that's sort of what you're interested in, even though you will never get it. Of course, if you try to imagine humans without religion, without culture, without morality, do you still have humans? I'm not sure you do. And I'm not sure we can take these elements out and say this is the natural human. But that's maybe what Bosch tried to do in his painting. In biology, there has been a long debate about the evolution of morality. And basically, there has been some confusion because natural selection is definitely a nasty process. It's a process of elimination, and there's not much nice to say about it. But natural selection has produced all sorts of things, and there's sort of two schools in biology. One is the school that says that we have a nasty process that can only produce a nasty nature, and that morality is just a veneer. That's all it is. And then there's another school that says that it has produced a social nature. After all, natural selection has produced elephants and dolphins and wolves and humans, which are highly social creatures, and that moral tendencies are an outflow of that, are an outgrowth of these tendencies. So the first school I call veneer theory, although none of the people who adhere to veneer theory want to be called like that, but that's what I call it, because basically it comes from Thomas Henry Huxley, who said that morality is a departure from nature. It cannot be explained by evolution. It is uniquely human, and it's calculated. So basically, if you are moral, it's because you have calculated that's the best thing to do under the circumstances. So the famous metaphor that Huxley used, Huxley was a contemporary of Darwin and was known as Darwin's bulldog because he defended evolutionary theory very effectively. But in this regard, he deviated from Darwin. And he had this metaphor that morality is like a garden. The gardener has to work very hard to keep things under control because things tend to go wild. And that's what nature is. Nature is wild. And so morality is something that we have to keep our nature under control. And that's the metaphor he used. And so morality is a lot of work, basically. That's what he was saying. Now Dawkins, who wrote The Selfish Gene, he wrote a whole book on how we are controlled by our genes. And then at the end, he says basically in the last sentence that we can throw them out. We alone on Earth can rebel against the tyranny of the selfish replicators. Which is, of course, an impossibility. You cannot go against your own genes. But also, it's a very Huxleyan view. It's like we can throw out these tendencies that we have, and we can become better than that. We can better ourselves, basically. It's a very Huxleyan view of duality, where we can go against our own nature. This is the most quoted line from that literature that we have gotten used to in the last 30 years, is that scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed. Basically saying that if you're nice to others, you're not following your nature. That's an impossibility. You cannot really be naturally nice to others. I want to illustrate this with a Monty Python sketch. And in the Monty Python sketch, you see a banker who doesn't understand what altruism is. He's never heard of it, and he doesn't really understand it.
Can you just give me the pound?
Yes, but you see, I don't know what it's for.
Well, it's for the orphans.
Yes?
It's a gift.
A what?
A gift.
Oh, a gift! A tax dodge!
No.
No, I don't understand. Can you just explain exactly what you want?
Well, I want you to give me £1, and then I'll go away and give it to the orphans.
Yes?
Well, that's it.
No, I don't follow this at all. I mean, I don't want to seem stupid, but it looks to me as though I'm £1 down on the whole deal.
Oh, yes, you are.
I am. Well, what is my incentive to give you the £1?
Well, the incentive is to make the orphans happy.
Happy? You're quite sure you've got this right?
Yes, lots of people give me money.
What, just like that?
Yes.
Must be sick. I don't suppose you could give me a list of their names and addresses.
No, I'll just go up to them in the street and ask.
Good Lord. That's the most exciting new idea I've heard in years.
Okay, so that's what we have grown up with the last 30 years, is what is my incentive? And everything had to have an incentive in biology. And actually, that's not how things work at the motivational level. Yes, that's how evolution works. Evolution certainly promotes characteristics that help you. But that doesn't mean that every case where altruism occurs, the motivation is necessarily related to incentives. And so the way I visualize veneer theory is that at the core we are very bad. This is human nature. Around it, we're not particularly good. And then we have this little layer of morality around it. And that's what veneer theory has, and that's what they have given us in the last 30 years. And I've objected it from the start because I'm very opposed to that kind of view. And I think it's a very shallow view of morality. The strange thing is that Huxley is extremely atheist, and Dawkins is extremely atheist. But there's also some religious people, like Francis Collins, a famous geneticist, who has taken morality as proof that God must exist, because he argues that morality could not have evolved. So in a way he has the same position as Huxley, that it's impossible to explain evolutionarily, but he takes it the other way. Huxley was an atheist, and Collins takes it as proof for the existence of God. Now, Darwin, usually much smarter than his followers, Darwin felt in The Descent of Man that morality is a product of evolution, that it is continuous what we see in other animals, and that it's emotionally based. He was very much influenced by Adam Smith and David Hume. And so that's the way he looked at it. And here you have a quote from Darwin who says, any animal, not just humans, any animal endowed with well-marked social instincts would inevitably acquire a moral sense as soon as its intellectual powers are similar to human intellectual powers. And so he saw morality as continuous with the social instincts in animals. So I want to defend the Darwinian view. I'm not an Huxleyan at all. And I want to go over different topics that relate to morality, because my view of human morality is that it places the community above the individual. It recognizes individual interests and selfishness and all of that, obviously, but it says at some point we have to have a well-functioning community, and in order to do that we need to do the following things, and that's what morality does. And I'm not going to claim that primates have morality like we do, but they have a lot of the tendencies that we have built into it. And so I will go over cooperation and empathy, and I will mention bonobos and say something about altruism, and in the end about fairness. So first, something on cooperation. There are many classical cooperation studies, but this is still the funniest, I think. This one was done in the 1920s at the Yerkes Primate Center, so that's long ago. That's like 100 years ago. And these are juvenile chimps who are pulling in a heavy box. And the box is too heavy for one chimp to pull in, so they have to coordinate. And on the box is obviously food, otherwise they wouldn't be working so hard. And so that's what they're doing here. And I'm showing you this to show that the issue of cooperation has a very long tradition in animal research. And we know it from the field, and we know it from the lab, and a lot of people have experimented on it. Now you get a more interesting situation. What they do now is they feed one of the two chimpanzees. So one of the two is not interested in the task anymore. So look what happens at the end. At the end, this chimp basically takes everything, which is very interesting. On the first hand, he knows that he needs the partner, so there's a full understanding of cooperation here. Second is that the partner is willing to help, even though the partner is not interested in the food. And this relates to long-term relationships that these animals have, and that, of course, humans have as well, that we call reciprocity relationships. So we do experiments on this kind of issues. This is the Yerkes field station where we keep chimpanzees. Yerkes is the only primate center really with a long tradition of chimpanzee research. And we do, for example, studies of reciprocity where we introduce food to the chimpanzees after we have measured in the morning. In the morning we measure who grooms whom for how long, which is something chimps do spontaneously. And then we introduce food and we see who shares with whom. And since we have 7,000 interactions, we can do a statistical comparison between the two and see if the one affects the other. And what you get in chimps is that if A grooms B, then B is more likely to share food with A later on. And it has no effect on B sharing with anybody else. It's specifically for the partner who did the grooming. And if you think about it, what you need for that is two things. You need, first of all, memory, in which chimps have an excellent memory. And so you need to remember the grooming that happened in the morning. And the second thing is that that memory needs to trigger a positive attitude, which in humans we call gratitude. And Bob Trivers, who wrote the theory of reciprocal altruism 30 years ago, already said that gratitude needed to be part of the equation. And so in chimpanzees we see that they're actually grateful for services received and repay the services, which is a very important part of human morality and human society. So the issue of empathy, I'm very interested in that, and I've written a whole book recently about empathy and the origins of empathy. In the US, empathy is sometimes equated with other things, like this is a political cartoon, where empathy is nothing but a code word for compassion, and the other then says it's socialism. And that's sort of the discussion you sometimes get in the US when Barack Obama proposed that the Supreme Court needed a judge with empathy. The Republicans were all in arms, like, why do we need empathy in society, you know? But empathy is a very old characteristic that goes back to even older characteristics. And the origin of it, I think, is is found in synchronization, which is found in tons of animals. Animals synchronize with each other, and in order to synchronize with others, you need to be aware of their bodies and to move the movements of to adopt the movements of the bodies. So you need to have what is known as motor mimicry. And motor mimicry leads in humans very often to empathy. So for example, if you're talking with a sad person and you adopt a sad body posture and a sad expression, you're going to feel sad because your body feeds back into your emotions. And that's actually how a lot of the transmission of emotions occurs in humans. So you can study that actually with yawn contagion. Yawn contagion is related to empathy because it's a form of motor mimicry. And yawn contagion, for example, to give one example, is absent in autistic children. So autistic children yawn as much as other children, but they don't have yawn contagion. And so it is thought to be related to empathy. And you can study that very easily. We do that in our chimpanzees. We present them with an animated head that yawns. That's what you see here. And this is a real chimpanzee who's watching a screen on which he sees cartoons like this being played. And so he's watching a screen that you cannot see, on which these things happen for him. And so he's starting to yawn. And yawn contagion is one of these motor mimicry issues that is related to empathy. This is neonatal imitation, which we have known for humans for 25 years. This is a 2-week-old baby rhesus monkey who's looking at an investigator who's opening his mouth to the monkey, and the monkey starts to make chewing movements. If the investigator sticks out his tongue, the monkey will start to lip smack and stick out its tongue. Probably all related to mirror neurons. Many of you have probably heard of mirror neurons. Never forget that mirror neurons, which are now linked to imitation and empathy in humans, were discovered not in humans. And actually the evidence is much better for these macaque monkeys than for humans. And they were discovered in macaques. Which means that they serve the same function and probably they do the same things in macaques as they do in humans. Neonatal contagion. This is a wolf pup.
So this is an ideal time now to start to begin to teach them their language. And the best place to start is with the howl. Let's see how he gets on. I guess that's what we call first lesson over.
So here you have a species-typical behavior. This wolf pup is, of course, not trained to do this. This is spontaneous. This is a human who imitates the howling of wolf. And wolves howl together before they hunt to get unity in the group. And motor mimicry is very much a bonding, and synchronization is very much a bonding mechanism. And so if you send, for example, humans out on a date who's instructed to mimic all your movements, you're going to like that date better at the end of the night than someone who's been instructed to counter your movements. And so we are very fond of mimicry and synchronization. We like it a lot, and we humans are very strong at it. And so if you go to a pop concert or a sports event, you see a lot of synchronization going on in the ranks of humans. Chimpanzees communicate by synchronization. These are two males who rule a colony together as a team, which is very typical of chimps. That's why we have chimpanzee politics, is because coalitions are important. And synchronization is used here as a communication device to show everyone we are united the same way humans do. And so the most important coalition on the world stage of the last decade, which you have already forgotten because we're all in denial, but this is the Bush-Blair coalition. They were like that. And this is Blair visiting Bush in Texas. And the British media would make fun of Blair. They would say, as soon as he goes to Texas, he walks like a cowboy. And that's what he's doing here. And if you think of it, if you walk next to someone of your age, let's say, you're going to adopt the same stride. We automatically synchronize with others, and all of this is related to empathy. Now, when we think of empathy, we obviously think more often of the emotional side of it, which is related to it. And the most basic form is emotional contagion. This is an actual painting with emotional contagion between a girl and a dog, or between the dog and a girl. I don't know which direction this is going. But there is a study on mice now. There's actually 5 studies on mice now. The first study on mice, which was published in Science, demonstrated that if, this is in a pain laboratory in Canada, where they found that if you test mice out of a box on a pain stimulus, the last mouse out of the box is more sensitive to pain than the first one was. And they didn't understand that, and they started testing it. And what they found is that if a mouse sees another mouse in pain, and it is seeing, it's not smelling or something like that, sees another mouse in pain, they become more sensitive to pain themselves. And it only works with mice that they know. If it's a mouse that they don't know, they're not affected by it, which is typical for basically all the empathy studies that we also have for humans. It's an in-group phenomenon most of the time. And so you may be surprised that mice have emotional contagion, which relates to empathy. But I personally think that empathy is going to be found in all the mammals, because the origin, and this is pretty much accepted also in neuroscience at the moment, the origin is probably maternal care. The female mammal, whether she's a mouse or an elephant, she needs to react right away to the distress of her offspring when they're hungry or in danger or cold or whatever, because if she doesn't, she's going to lose her offspring. And so the female mouse and the female elephant both have a good reason to be empathic. And that's where it probably started, and which would explain why empathy is more developed in females than males, also in the human species. Would also explain why oxytocin, which is par excellence a maternal hormone, has an effect on empathy in both men and women. If you spray oxytocin in the nostrils of research subjects, they become more empathic and trusting to each other. So empathy is often defined, this is a dictionary definition, is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. So you see both elements, the understanding part and the feeling part in there. And so I basically think empathy has 2 channels. It has an emotional channel, which is also a body channel of synchronization and motor mimicry and contagion. You laugh when someone laughs, and you yawn when someone yawns, and all of this. And it has a cognitive part, at least in the human adult. Not necessarily in young children, but it has a cognitive part where you need to have a self-other distinction. So you're not just affected by the other, but you also draw a line between yourself and the other, which helps you take the perspective of the other. And perspective taking is an important part of full-blown empathy as we know it. Now, this self-other distinction, or perspective taking, allows an other orientation, so allows you to get out of just the emotional contagion and to start worrying about the other and to be interested in the situation of the other, so that you can show sympathetic concern, as it is called, or targeted helping, which is helping specific to the situation of the other. Now, we know that this correlates with mirror self-recognition. There's many studies on children. So certainly in children, at exactly the age where they start to recognize themselves in the mirror and have this stronger sense of self-identity, is also where they start to show these more complex forms of altruism and empathy. And it has been speculated that the same is true at species evolution, and that certain species, there's very few, who recognize themselves in the mirror. Certain species have these complex forms of empathy. So I think apes are special. Apes are not monkeys, as you know. We are basically apes, we're not monkeys. Apes adopt somebody else's perspective. And so one of these other orientations that you see in apes is consolation behavior, which is very typical of them. This is a male chimpanzee who is screaming after a fight that he lost, and a juvenile comes over and embraces him and calms him down, and that's called consolation. And this is human consolation, which looks very similar. And so consolation is something we are very familiar with, because we do it basically all the time. We do it at funerals or at sports events where we are the losing team and so on. We do that kind of stuff all the time, but it's... Oh, my sound has disappeared. Can that be reinstated? Oh yeah, there we are. So we do studies on it, and this is actually, I'm not going to go into the details, but this is a study of 4,000 consolations in our chimpanzees to show that it's not just a little story. This is something that happens repeatedly all the time, and you can do scientific studies on it. And what we found in this study is that females do it more than males, which is what you would expect. Also in humans, and actually has been found in humans, and all the child studies had been found that girls do this sort of thing more than boys. But we also found, interestingly enough, that the high-ranking If the consolers are medium and low ranking, the females do more than the males. But if they're high ranking, the males do more than the females. And this is because the top ranking male has a very special function in the chimpanzee community and is the one who keeps order and peace, and apparently also the one who provides consolation to distressed parties. So targeted helping, and I'm not going to say much about this, but targeted helping requires that you take the perspective of somebody else, requires that you understand the specific situation of somebody else. Let me give you one example. This happened at a zoo in Sweden where a juvenile chimp had a rope around its neck twice and was choking to death. No one could get in there to help the juvenile because chimps are far too dangerous for that, but the alpha male of the group, and this is the specific role of that kind of males, went to the juvenile and picked him up, and so took the pressure off the rope and then unwrapped the rope and put the juvenile down. This is a very smart response, because he could also have pulled at the rope or pulled at the juvenile, which would be an impulsive thing to do, and which would have killed it. And so targeted helping requires that you understand the situation of somebody else and decide what is the best course of action in this particular situation. And there's many examples of this. So this correlates, I think, with mirror self-recognition. And in chimpanzees, we definitely know that they recognize themselves in the mirror as opposed to your dog or your cat who doesn't. But chimpanzees do, and there are many tests that have been done. We tried to test it on elephants. Elephants are known to be highly altruistic and to be highly empathic and to be very much affected by the emotional states of others. And so Gordon Gallup already 25 years ago predicted that if there's any animal apart from the apes who should recognize themselves in the mirror, it's the elephant. Now, the elephant had been tested before and failed to test. But believe it or not, the elephants were tested on a mirror of about this size. And so that's very hard to see yourself in. And so we decided we work on Asian elephants, and we do actually lots of studies also on consolation behavior in elephants. And so we decided to set up a elephant-proof, jumbo-sized mirror at the Bronx Zoo. And what you will see is footage that comes from a little camera in the mirror. So here are the elephants with the mirror. This is Happy, the elephant, who has a cross above her eye and another cross that you cannot see, which is the same substance without the coloring in it on the other side. So she can only see this mark through the mirror. She cannot see it without the mirror. And she's already slamming her trunk, as you can see, in the direction of the cross. So this is the same as test that we do on children, of course. It's to see if they connect their mirror image with their own body. And now she's going to touch it. There she goes. Very carefully, she touches the mark while she looks with the other eye in the mirror. And so Happy passed the mark test. And dolphins have also passed the mark test, just like chimpanzees. And basically, the feeling is now that all the mammals with very complex empathy and helping responses are also the mammals, and this is not accidental, we think, that have mirror self-recognition. And so for the elephants, that's supported now.
In their eagerness to drink, the smaller adopted calf is shoved over the edge and into the mud. Now the danger of a buffalo stampede is even greater than before. The thick mud sucks at the calf's back legs. Following the matriarch's lead, they all climb into the mud to help. Desperate attempts to break down the bank only make the problem worse. The two females combine efforts, using tusks and trunks like shovels to keep the calf from drowning, while another digs a ramp. Together, the two females squeeze and push at the calf. The suction underneath is suddenly released, and the calf is free. at last.
So what's interesting about this is you see very much those two channels that I talked about in operation. You see the emotional activation. These elephants are they're rumbling, they have their ears out, they have their tails out, they're very upset by what is happening. And you see a smart response, which is that they understand what the situation is and what needs to be done under these particular conditions. So there's some perspective taking going on, which is very important for the more complex forms of empathy. Can I go back to the slides again? Yeah, there we go. So a few things about bonobos, which I think are the most empathic of all the apes, more so than chimpanzees, and they're also much more peaceful than chimpanzees. Bonobos, they have their own ways of doing things. This is the way they reconcile. They have sex when they reconcile. They would fit very well in the garden of lusts of Hieronymus Bosch, I think. And bonobos, they use sex to diffuse tensions and to resolve problems. And so the most reliable way actually to get sex among them is to introduce food, because that introduces competition, and competition is resolved with sex. And so that's what you're going to see here. You're going to see here a few bonobos who get food, and they're resolving the issues with sex. So they're sort of multitasking here, eating while they have sex, which is typical of bonobos. And just to show you a case of altruism, just one of these many cases that you can see. This is a little male here who's waiting for a female who's being introduced, and the female catches some food for him at another place and brings it to him. And so she's going out of her way to find food for him to share, and he takes that from her. And so this has been tested systematically also on bonobos. They're extremely altruistic animals. So the way I look at that is that empathy is a very general characteristic in the mammals. And empathy can lead to sympathy and compassion if you get it combined with other orientation, which requires self-identity. And if you get this combination, empathy may lead, it doesn't always, but may lead to sympathy and compassion. And those two may lead to altruistic action, like the targeted helping that I showed you. But there's, of course, some sort of filter between that, because not every case of sympathy can lead to altruistic action. And so this is the way we now envision how these things happen. And there's a lot of studies now on altruistic behavior. And altruism is a question in biology, and this is actually a picture that sort of gives that, is if everyone is selfish, how could an altruist survive in a completely selfish society? That's a real puzzle. And the opposite also. If everyone is altruistic and you introduce a selfish individual, he's going to get a lot of benefits from all these altruists around him, and he doesn't need to do anything back. And so how is that resolved? And so in biology, the altruism question is basically a question of how could these tendencies have evolved. But at the moment, we're moving to a new era where we're not just interested in the evolutionary reasons for altruism, but we're also getting interested in the motivations behind it. How do animals decide to be altruistic under one condition and not another condition? And so there are many studies now. There's about 8 studies on primates. It used to be said that, of course, humans may occasionally be altruistic, but certainly animals have no genuine altruism. But now there's about 8 studies. This is one of them. This is a study where one chimpanzee has the tools that another one needs to get food, and to see if they want to give it to the other, and they actually do that. And so there's about 8 studies that demonstrate altruistic tendencies, genuinely altruistic tendencies in the primates. And just to show you one of these studies that we did ourselves, where we asked, do primates care about the well-being of somebody else? It's a very simple experiment that we do here at the Yerkes Primate Center, which is very close by, where we have capuchin monkeys, and we present them with tokens from which they can choose. They don't know at the beginning of the study what these tokens mean. So one token is the pro-social token, the other one is the selfish token. But when we start the 30 trials or whatever we do, they don't know yet what these tokens mean. They have to discover that in the course of the experiment. So they get these tokens presented to them. They have been trained to give tokens back to us for food. So they know the exchange paradigm. And here the monkey picks a pro-social token and has to give it back to us. And then we put it between them to remind them of what they picked. And then both of them get fed. The monkey on the right is not doing anything, it's only eating. And the one that's on the left is making all the choices. Picks again the pro-social token, has to give it back to us. They get both fed again. And now we get, as example, the selfish token. And she picks the selfish token. And then she only gets fed herself. Because that's what it is, the selfish token. And so in the course of the 30 trials, this monkey learns that one token has different consequences than the other. Now the interesting thing is that for herself, it doesn't matter at all. Whichever one she picks, she gets a little piece of apple. That's the reward. It's the partner who gets something or nothing, depending on what she picks. And so then the question is, does she care about that? And what we find is that the random choice would be 50%. And here you see the graphs. The first one is non-kin, meaning unrelated monkeys. They go over 50, they go to over 60% in picking the pro-social token by the end of the session. We repeat it with the same pairs and differently colored tokens to see if we can get it again. And we get it again. And then we do it with kin, and we go even higher. And then we do it with strangers, and they drop to 50%. And strangers, of course, that's a bit similar to the mouse study that I mentioned, and there's many human studies that show that empathy is biased towards the in-group. And I think this is an empathy-regulated behavior that probably relates to self-reward mechanism, which has been discovered in humans also. In humans, of course, humans feel good when they do good, and this has been demonstrated in neuroscience experiments recently, that the pleasure centers in your brain light up when you give money to charity, for example. So we think that this is the mechanism that regulates this behavior. Now, in all these studies that we do with the capuchin monkeys, we discovered something unusual with Sarah Brosnan. And this happened in experiments that we were doing, very similar to the pulling task that you saw with the chimpanzees. And here you have two monkeys pulling in a heavy tray, and there's food on the tray. And we discovered that they're very sensitive to the distribution of food. And we didn't think it was a particularly big deal, because I think many pet owners know that animals are sensitive to the distribution of affection and food. But in the literature, there was a big deal made out of this, and it's called inequity aversion. And inequity aversion had been claimed to be related to the sense of fairness, and the sense of fairness had been claimed to be uniquely human. Some even claiming, which I found excessive, that we didn't have a sense of fairness before the French Revolution, because it was invented by the French philosophers. So that's how far these things went. And so certainly no one was ready to hear that monkeys might have a sense of fairness. So what we did in this study, this is with Sarah Brosnan, giving a token to a monkey, the monkey would have to give it back, and right away it would get rewarded with a little piece of cucumber. Now cucumber is not highly valued, but a monkey will eat a piece of cucumber anytime he gets it. And so that's what we did. And then the next step was to pair that monkey with another monkey who would not get cucumber, but would get grapes. And grapes are far better than cucumber. And so then we created inequity that way. So here you see the experiment. One monkey is exchanging tokens, which in this case are rocks, and we hold up a hand, and another monkey is watching. And if both monkeys get cucumber, which is the equity test, they reject only 5% of the time, meaning 95% of the time they are happy to do this. And so almost all the time they exchange, and there's no problem between them and us, or between them. And if we give a grape to the partner, then the rejection rate goes to 50%. The monkeys become actually agitated. They don't like this experiment anymore. They throw the rocks out of the cage, they throw the food out of the cage. And the food is interesting because the economists call that an irrational response. The monkeys have an irrational response because the rational thing to do is that whatever you can get, you should always take it. That's the rational thing to do. But humans also, you know, the ultimatum game with humans is being played by economists. Humans also reject offers that they perceive as unfair. Even though the rational thing would be to accept it, it's an irrational response. We don't think it is an irrational response. We actually think that this relates to cooperation in monkey society and cooperation in human society. If you have a cooperative society, you need to watch what you get. You invest in the cooperation, you need to be carefully watching that you get something out of the cooperation. And so it's actually the rational thing to do is occasionally to reject that kind of offers. Now, if you give the grape to the partner, so that the partner doesn't need to do anything anymore, then they reject even more. So there's a sensitivity to effort, which also in humans is very important in inequity. So here you see a little video of it. You will see Sarah walking back and forth between those two monkeys doing the experiment. So the first part is the equity test, which is the least interesting part. And this is where both monkeys get cucumber. These monkeys normally live in a group. They live in a larger group, but we take them out for a while for the experiment. So this monkey gives a rock, gets a cucumber, and we do that many times in a row. And we just walk back and forth between the two. And as you see, they're perfectly fine with this. Now we get the other one, where we give grapes to one and cucumber to the other. This monkey gives a rock and gets a grape, which is good. This one gives a rock and gets cucumber. Look carefully what happens with the cucumber. There it goes. So this one gives a rock, gets a grape. This one gives a rock, gets cucumber. Now she drops it. Here it is. And look at the other monkey. This one gives a rock, gets a grape. This one is now has lost interest. This one doesn't want to perform anymore. And so this is a study on inequity that we did in the monkeys, then later we did it in chimpanzees, and I'll soon mention some other species. But the interesting thing is that I usually call it an egocentric sense of fairness. It's the sort of sense of fairness that you find in very young children. If you come home from a long trip and you would have a beautiful present for one and a very little thing for the other, they wouldn't be very happy. And so young children are very sensitive to that kind of inequity, which is inequity that is to their disadvantage. Now, the sense of fairness of humans is, of course, always asymmetrical. You never see bankers walking in the street protesting against that they earn too much, for example. You see people walking in the street saying that they're earning too little. So our sense of fairness is always asymmetrical. But Sarah has recently found in chimpanzees that there are certain combinations of chimpanzees where the one who gets the grape also refuses. So the one who gets the grape refuses until the other guy also gets a grape. And that's getting very interesting. That's getting much closer to the human sense of fairness than what we found in the monkeys. Now, the same thing has been done on dogs, and what they do in dogs is they bring two dogs in from the same home who know each other. They put them side by side. The dogs are not sensitive to differential reward, but they're sensitive to one getting something, the other getting nothing. And so the dogs have to give the paw. And if you do that many times in a row, and you can get both dogs to do that without any rewards. So if there's no rewards, there are rewards in view, but if there are no rewards given, they will do it without. If you start to reward one of them systematically and not the other, then the other gets upset and refuses. And this is a refusing dog who doesn't want to do the task anymore after the other dog has gotten a lot of pieces of sausage, which they also smell, of course, at the same time. So that's the dog inequity study. And basically, we think that in all cooperative animals, you're not going to find this in cats, which are solitary hunters, but in all cooperative animals, you're going to find some sensitivity to reward distribution because that's how they need to operate in order to have cooperation. So to wrap up, let me say, Darwin was right, in my opinion, on the origins of morality, and these are findings of human studies that I'm not discussing. I didn't have time for that, but in humans we know now that morality is very emotionally driven, and when you put people in a brain scanner and you look at their moral decision making, very ancient areas of the brain that are related to the emotions are activated, and so moral decision-making is not just a prefrontal cortex type of thing that we're doing. It's very deeply embedded in the brain, and that we have an immediate gut empathy and an immediate gut feeling about certain moral decisions. And in primates, we find reciprocity and fairness. So also mechanisms of memory and gratitude, for example. We find empathy and consolation and other-oriented actions, such as targeted helping in some species. And we certainly find pro-social tendencies in the primates. And none of this amounts to morality as we know it. But try to imagine human morality as we know it without this. Try to imagine human morality without a sense of reciprocity, without a sense of fairness, without empathy and interest in the situation of others. I don't think you would get there, and which means that human morality is built on top of a primate psychology that we have and that we share with other primates. And I thank all the people who work with me and who do all these interesting studies, and I thank you. So we may have time for a few questions, do we? 5 minutes, okay. Yeah, we can try that. Maybe we can turn the lights up and so that I can see who is asking the questions. Do we need a microphone?
Thank you very much, Dr. de Waal. I hope that you'll present this to the next Tea Party convention. But my question is, I've recently, partly because of the Starhawk's most recent book on the Earth Path, had reason to revisit the Gaia hypothesis of Lynn Margulis. And a point that that comes through very strongly there is that evolution doesn't occur in species individually. That what's going on is that there's a lot of symbiotic change occurring. And I notice almost all of your experiments, I know that produces considerable problems for an experimental environment, but I do sort of wonder a little bit whether some of the behaviors you're seeing aren't things that are also happening relative to other things going on in evolutionary development with other species, or in the larger ecology that chimpanzees or dolphins or whatever are growing up in.
Yeah. So let me say something about interspecies relations. I don't think empathy evolved for the purpose of dealing with other species. So we can have empathy, for example, with a stranded whale. Now, I don't think evolution produced empathy in the human species to deal with stranded whales, because we didn't have any whales in our past. And so it evolved in the context of small communities where it served to help your relatives or your immediate friends and the individuals that you knew. But once the capacity exists, that's the interesting thing. Once you have the capacity for empathy, it can be applied far and wide. And that's what we're trying to do in human society at the moment. We have a society, of course, that is far bigger than any human society in the distant past. But we're still trying to rely on that mechanism of empathy in all these distant relationships that we have. And so interspecies relationships in the field, in primates, for example, they can be friendly. Some primates are symbiotic with other primates. They can be friendly, but sometimes they're hostile also. And that's true for so many animals, is that they have hostile relationships with some species and friendly relationships with others. Maybe you can shout. Oh, no, there's the mic. Okay.
I just love your work. I think it's brilliant. May I use the term natural order for one piece of it? And might I suggest that religion, as we're defining it, is the unnatural order, meaning that when we've, in an Eastern sense, there is no sense of religion separate from the natural order. The term dharma, however we look at it, is all-inclusive, or a rubric, whereas in a Western sense, when you move out of Eden from a natural state, you need an order. And so my suggestion is perhaps this dichotomy is not always the same when you look at it from different perspectives. So that conflict is not necessarily there. But I'd like to say that sometimes religion becomes the unnatural order. In other words, the way when we as human beings become more selfish or less natural. As I said to my friend Jane Goodall, how's life with a lower species in humanity, that religion, in one sense, lays down the ethical framework when we move out of what you have nicely put as the natural order. Does that?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I think since morality deals with the community level, and religion deals with that also with the community level, because it supports usually morality, there is at some point that there's a conflict. You know, you may want to act like this, but the community requires that you act like that and enforces certain rules to do it that way. And so there's sometimes a conflict. And I just want to say that I think community concern is also present in the primates. We've seen in chimpanzees, for example, that if two males have a big fight and they don't reconcile, that sometimes old females step in and make them reconcile. And they drag one male to the other and they make sure that they groom each other and they make up after the fight. They take the weapons that they have out of their hands, the rocks and the sticks that they have. And so that gives me the impression that in chimpanzees there is a certain concern about the communities. Like, this is the way we want to live together and this is not the way we want to live together, which is really what morality is about. And so there's sometimes a conflict to what individuals want to do and what the community requires. And so in that sense, you could argue that morality is unnatural, but I think it's actually a continuation of what we see in other primates. Do we need to wrap up now? Yeah, okay. This is the mic.
I think we should wrap up now to stay on time, but we would encourage all of you to come to the session at 1:15 to follow up on this more and the implications of this for studying religion. Thank you very much.